I'm Niall Paterson. On this edition of the Sky News Daily, our focus is, of course, on Lucy Letby. As a nurse in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, she was supposed to look after the most vulnerable of newborns. Instead, and it is difficult to imagine a more heinous set of crimes, a jury has decided that over the course of a year, Letby was guilty of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6. The Department of Health has now promised an independent inquiry into the circumstances around these murders and attempted murders, including how concerns raised by clinicians were ultimately dealt with. A warning, as you might expect, much of what follows in this podcast will be descriptions of those crimes. Our correspondent Katerina Vittozzi has been following this trial over the many months it took to reach this point. Katerina, just walk us through what we've heard.
Lucy Letby has been found guilty of the murder of 7 babies, the attempted murder of 6 babies, after jury deliberations of 110 hours here at Manchester Crown Court. These were all children who were on the neonatal ward at the Countess of Chester Hospital between June 2015 and June 2016. Amongst her victims were baby boys, baby girls, sets of twins, and included 2 boys from a set of triplets. These were children that Lucy Letby, now 33, but at the time of these attacks was in her mid-20s, had a duty to protect, to care for and to heal. Instead, the jury here has decided that she attacked and tried to kill them. The nature of these crimes is difficult to comprehend, even tougher to report, and the scale of them is absolutely unprecedented. And after these guilty verdicts here today at Manchester Crown Court, Lucy Letby now bears the title of one of the UK's most prolific child serial killers of modern times. And we can also now report that the verdicts were delivered over the course of several days, that Lucy Letby was present to hear some of those guilty verdicts, but today she made that decision not to be in court to hear that she was found guilty of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others. She declined to appear via video link as well. But in court, in a case that has lasted 10 months, where there has been so much forensic detail, where there has been medical evidence, where we have heard from expert witness and the testimonies of colleagues of Lucy Letby. But when it came to the delivery of these guilty verdicts, there were highs of emotion, the types of which you rarely see in a courtroom. The victims' families present for much of the trial, and also to hear those guilty verdicts being read out. There were gasps in the courtroom as some of those families heard that their children indeed had been attacked and killed by former neonatal nurse Lucy Letby. Many of those families burst into floods of tears. They were comforting each other as one guilty verdict was read out over the course of the past few days. One child's mother held what looked like a stuffed rabbit toy close to her face. What now? Well, that we have heard from the judge in this case that sentencing of Lucy Letby will happen on Monday. Again, we understand from her defence team that Lucy Letby will not be present to hear what sentence will be passed in her absence. But the jury here, as I say, 110 hours of deliberation to bring those guilty verdicts, the murder of 7 babies, the attempted murder of 6 others. They also returned verdicts of not guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder and were unable to come to a decision on 6 further counts of attempted murder. And over the course of this trial, and the jury during their deliberations have agreed that the types of attacks and murders that Lucy Letby carried out involved her abusing the trust that was given to her because she wore an NHS badge and was a nurse on that hospital ward between June 2015 and June 2016. But we can also report at this time that Cheshire Police have confirmed that they are now looking into whether Lucy Letby could have been responsible for any further attacks outside of that timescale of the attacks involved in this case. So beyond that 2015 to 2016 timeframe, we know that she was a nurse for several years before that at the Countess of Chester Hospital, that she also worked in work placements at Liverpool Women's Hospital as well. So that confirmation coming from Cheshire Police, who have been driving this investigation since suspicions were first raised to them all the way back in 2017.
Katerina, worth pointing out, this is actually now one of the UK's longest-running murder trials, months in duration.
Longest-running murder trials and one of the UK's longest jury deliberations as well, and it has been quite an extraordinary thing for the jury here to have to deliberate on. They have been, as I say, going over months of medical evidence, medical reports, witness statements. It has been a challenge for media to sit and listen to that and digest it. They've also had to analyse and look at the ways in which she attacked these children. We know now from the testimonies, from the medical evidence, that she used medical equipment and medicines that were at her disposal on the ward in order to attack these children. She poisoned some with insulin, others she force-fed excessive milk, some she injected with excessive air, and others she simply physically assaulted.
And what of the families, the impact on them that when the jury was discharged, when these verdicts were read in full, Lucy Letby wasn't there to hear them?
Well, I think it will be utter torture, to be frank, for the families who have been here consistently throughout the course of this 9-month trial. Many have turned up every day of this jury deliberation in order to hear the verdicts from the jury and in order to see justice being delivered for them. And Lucy Letby to make that decision not to be there to hear several of these verdicts come back, for her decision not to be in court now for the rest of legal proceedings and not to be here on Monday when we expect sentencing to happen, deeply disturbing for the families. I should also say that Lucy Letby's parents have been also in court during these proceedings, over the trial, and for most of these jury deliberations. As I say, these were verdicts that were delivered over several different stages. Lucy Letby was in court to hear the first 2 deliveries of those verdicts, guilty verdicts. At that time, she did cry. Her parents cried. They were heard whispering to each other, "You can't be serious, this can't be right," and then breaking down in tears. But also equally on the other side of the courtroom, we had the families of those tiny babies, families who had just found out that Lucy Letby was guilty of murdering and attacking their child, or in some cases their children. And for those families not to now be able to see Lucy Letby in person for the rest of these legal proceedings, well, I think that will be a very, very bitter pill for them to swallow after 10 months of a trial, which we know, having spoken to the families of some of the victims, a trial that has absolutely pushed them to the absolute physical and mental limit. One family we spoke to said to have to hear Lucy Letby sit in the dock and consistently deny hurting their children, when we now know that a jury has decided that she was guilty of murdering 7 babies and guilty of the attempted murder of 6 other babies.
We've been hearing outside court from some of those involved, including a visibly moved DCI, Nicola Evans, who of course co-led the investigation.
When I say that all of their babies will forever be in our hearts, I would like to thank all of the families in this case for their exceptional resilience and strength throughout this entire investigation. Their composure and their dignity during this trial has been truly overwhelming.
We have also been hearing from the hospital, the Countess of Chester, the medical director there, in fact. We had an apology, but frankly, from my perspective, not much else. So we'll see if there is more to come from them in the coming days and weeks. Katerina, you've been following this case for the more than 9 months it has taken to get to this point. So for people not as familiar as you, just tell us, who was Lucy Letby?
She was a nurse at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. She had graduated from the University of Chester in 2011. Over the course of this 9-month trial and then the jury deliberation that's followed, we have learnt a lot more about the sort of person that she presented herself as to the world. Someone who was dedicated to her job, but someone who also had a pretty active social life. Over the course of the trial, we heard that she'd go to weekly salsa classes with colleagues, that she'd go on holidays to places like Ibiza with friends. She was regularly using social media to text colleagues and friends about what was happening on the ward. But beneath that smiling persona that she presented was what someone on the prosecution team described to me as a much darker side to her personality, someone who was devious, calculated and cold-blooded, and someone that was accused of the most unimaginable scale of crimes, 7 counts of murder and 15 counts of attempted murder involving 17 babies in all.
And this Letby was an individual who, by merit of her job, had direct access to some very sick children, but also through the specialist training that she received, she would have been seen as the point of contact for many of the very most sickest children.
Yeah, because on the neonatal ward that they had at that point at the Countess of Chester Hospital, they were taking on babies who were up sometimes several months premature. And even within the ward itself, there were different nursery rooms from 1 to 4, one being known as the hot room, where the sickest or most unwell or most premature babies would be, up into sort of a room which was considered a bit more of a nursery, where there were still maybe premature babies but were considered a bit lower risk. And Lucy Letby worked across all of these rooms, but particularly nursery 1. And over the course of the trial, what was clear from the prosecution case is they say that triggers for Lucy Letby to carry out some of these attacks would be things like boredom. She had texted colleagues saying, I'm on the lower risk rooms today, I wish I was working in nursery 1. The prosecution would put forward the case that she was often angling to be looking after the sickest babies as a cover then for trying to cover her tracks when these babies would fall unexpectedly and unexplainably sick, and in some cases would die.
What was the view of Letby amongst those that she worked alongside?
Well, she did have, it must be said, some friends on the ward. We heard through the trial, and as I've said, you know, she would go on holiday with some of these colleagues. So she did have friendships on the ward. We saw text messages and exchanges between her and friends, and also from some on the management side who would text her and say, we think you're doing a good job. But we also know that there were some colleagues who had suspicions as early as October 2015, and that's because they started to see a pattern. And what they were starting to see was this spike in deaths that they believed were unexplained and unexpected, which in neonatal terms means that there's been no prior indication sort of 24 hours before that event that something might be happening. And what they were seeing is the common link that often Lucy Letby would be on shift, or she would be near that child when it would unexpectedly collapse and in some cases died. And we know from this trial, and also speaking to colleagues of Lucy Letby subsequently, that they did report their concerns, as I said, as early as October 2015 to hospital bosses. And as time went on, those concerns and those suspicions got even stronger. We spoke to one nurse who worked at the hospital, said her reputation became so infamous, even within the unit and in the hospital.
There's a lot of suspicion, and when alarms would go off during the night especially, there would be a phrase that people would use, colleagues that I know have used, I wonder if Lucy's working tonight.
And that just goes to show, really, it was something which was, if not known, and they didn't necessarily, they felt like they had evidence for it on the wall, because that's certainly what we heard hospital bosses would say to colleagues, that we don't have evidence to move on at the minute. They certainly had suspicions, and they felt that there was a link.
Just in terms of this specific investigation, the police investigation, when did they get involved then, and how did they get to this, well, guilty verdict?
By July 2016, Lucy Letby had been moved off the ward entirely and put into an administrative role. Then there was an internal NHS investigation, and it was then not until early 2017 that the hospital eventually contacted Cheshire Police. I was speaking to the senior investigating officer, Paul Hughes, about it, and he said, I received a letter from the hospital and we were asked to look at whether we thought an investigation was necessary. And they said they went to the hospital, they spoke to consultants from the neonatal ward who explained to them their concerns that they had about this spike in neonatal deaths that they had seen during that time.
And what they explained is it was unexpected, and unexplained are two words they don't deal with in neonatal medicine. If a child collapses, it's usually explainable, and it's usually always expected. But what they were struggling to deal with was the fact that these babies were, in their terms, albeit in a specialist unit, they were well, and it was unexpected they would collapse, and it was furthermore unexpected that they would tragically die in some of the cases. So, armed with that information and being able to review what had already come in, I was able to say that we had to investigate it ourselves.
From the very beginning, their process was to look for things it could be apart from inflicted harm. So they were looking at, could it have been criminal negligence? Could it have been something else that was happening on the ward? But he said after speaking with medical experts independent of the hospital, by looking at medical records, speaking to members of staff, they got to a point where they realised that the only thing that could have happened to all the babies involved in this case was, they believed, inflicted harm. And then when they looked at the shift pattern, who was working on the ward, what time, what day, and how it correlated with the babies involved in this trial, they said that Lucy Letby was the only member of staff who was on shift over all incidents involved in this case.
But wasn't it the case, at least during the investigation, that the police discovered some pretty incriminating evidence written in her own hand that certainly seemed to point the finger of blame directly at her? I mean, she obviously pleaded not guilty, but, you know, there was some prima facie evidence of her guilt right from the get-go.
Yes, so they carried out, the police, really extensive searches, not only of Lucy Letby's house in Chester, but also her parents' address in Hereford. And they found a couple of things. They found bags and bags and bags of medical paperwork, handover notes, stashed into Morrison's shopping bags. Of course, obviously, these confidential notes, she shouldn't be taking them off the ward. The prosecution believed that this was a sign of her clinging on to souvenirs, because some of these handover notes and medical notes involved the children that had been involved in this case. But also within that, there were scribbled notes with words such as, I am evil, I did this. Things saying, I don't deserve to be here because I'm evil, and this is what I did. There are a couple of different interpretations of these notes, of course, that were brought up in the trial. The prosecution saying that this was evidence of a woman who was in turmoil at the guilt at what she had done. A very different interpretation presented by the defence, in that they say these notes were written by a woman who'd been accused of the most unthinkable crimes, and this was essentially her unravelling. It was also interesting, though, I spoke with the Crown Prosecution Service, the prosecuting lawyer who worked with the Cheshire Constabulary to bring this case to trial, a woman called Pascal Jones, and she said actually in her view, the note that said, I'm evil, I did this, she didn't believe that was the smoking gun in this case.
I've been quite clear when I was asked about this case, particularly to my hierarchy, we have no smoking gun, and I've never considered this note that she wrote as a smoking gun. But one of the strengths of the case was nevertheless that it was contemporaneously recorded. So we had these medical records, and all of these accounts are circumstantial, but they paint a compelling picture of abnormal events, aberrations that people shouldn't see. And indeed, that's what struck the experts. Things shouldn't happen that way, and they don't happen that way.
You must have been sitting just a handful of metres away from Lucy Letby for large parts of this trial, Katerina. I'm wondering how she presented herself to the court, to the jury.
Well, she certainly looks very different now from that photograph that I think people will be pretty familiar now. She's, 8 years older than she was when these attacks were carried out. She's a bit fuller of figure. Her hair is now dark brown. Remember, she's been remanded in custody since 2020, so she's been in prison effectively for the past 3 years. She's always comes to court very smartly dressed. She sat for 7 weeks on and off giving evidence and responding to questions from the prosecution. And in all of that, She is surrounded by enormous files, going through all the medical evidence, and she's very vigorous, or she was very vigorous in her defence. She didn't come across as someone who was shy and retiring. She extremely firmly denied every charge that was put to her. In some cases, she was also quite quick to point the finger at other colleagues, naming them by name, saying, I actually think it was this person who was at fault in this case. And in terms of, I suppose, her demeanour, it was quite pointed that she cried when she was talking about the impact that this trial and her arrest has had on her life, on her career. But, and this was a point that the prosecution picked up on when they cross-examined her, when it came to actually talking about the deaths of the children and the unexpected collapses of the children in her care, the tears pretty much stopped.
Clearly the prosecution, from what I understand of the case, were trying to say something about her character. There was an awful lot of focus on how truthful she was being, obviously about the charges themselves, but about the smaller stuff, about things like wearing pyjamas when the police turned up. What's your understanding of what the CPS were basically trying to do there?
They were just trying to chip away effectively at her credibility, and the prosecution said openly, you know, you are someone who is trying to curry favour, you're trying to cut yourself a person that we should feel sympathy for. So saying, for example, she had said at one point in an interview with the police and in her defence that how upsetting it had been and how demoralising it had been to be arrested and be in her pyjamas. Well, the prosecution said, we've got video evidence, police body cam footage to show that you were in a tracksuit, and they felt she was doing it very deliberately, very manipulatively, to try and cut a figure to the jury of someone who had been scapegoated by her colleagues and someone who was under attack, an innocent woman who'd been accused of these unimaginable crimes and was someone that the jury should feel sympathy for. But again, in the interviews that we've had with the Crown Prosecution Service, and Pascal Jones, as I said, who's really brought the charges and the trial to this point alongside the police, said she was an incredibly manipulative person.
She was quite a zealous propagandist at many levels, certainly putting herself forward as a dedicated nurse. The problem is behind that very angelic smile, there was a much darker side to her personality, and that's what the trial has exposed. She had the ability to claim that the unit was dysfunctional, that other staff were incompetent, that children were in a bad way when she found them in a reasonable condition, and that was all to justify what she was doing to them.
Katerina, you've been speaking to the parents of two of the babies involved who were referred to in court as Baby L and Baby M. Now you can infer from that this was a multiple birth. Letby was found guilty of their attempted murder, and I just want to let listeners hear some of your conversation, and I hope that they understand that for reasons of privacy, we've had actors revoice their words. At first, we'll hear from the father and then the mother of babies L and M.
Well, on the Saturday, the 9th of April, we'd come down with my parents to see the boys. Everything was going well. We held the boys. We went back upstairs because my wife was in the ward upstairs, and then within 10, 15 minutes, a nurse is coming charging upstairs saying, you need to come back down. And I was there first because my wife was still in bed. I was the first one into the unit at that time. The image that I saw was just horrendous. That image I'll never forget because it's on the brain. When I went down, I saw doctors around the trolley and they're just pumping his heart like a rag doll, really.
One of the nurses said to me, I've not done anything. And Lucy was behind her, and I was just praying to God, saying, what has happened to my child? I've not done anything wrong in my life to anybody, so why do I have to suffer? And then after 30 minutes, he recovered.
What did you see of Lucy Letby at that point?
She was just standing like that, very calm and cool. At the time, her body language and her behaviour totally changed. After the incident happened, I think she was unsuccessful with killing my kids. That's why she was very annoyed with us. She thought that I couldn't kill your baby. She was very cool, calm, calculated, and a criminal-minded lady, but we didn't notice anything at the time. When the police came to our house and told us, your second child is involved with Lucy, we were shocked and we said we didn't know about baby L. Why had they not told us about baby L? We did know about baby M, but they hadn't told us about baby L.
So they didn't tell you that he had gone into any difficulty at all?
No, not the insulin and all the blood sugars and all that. We didn't know anything about that until the police came. It's hard to put into words just how it could have gone on so long, why it went on so long. These are the answers we need. But that's a different part of the investigation. We have to wait for the hospital to answer those questions, but it could have been stopped. That's the fact.
Do you think the hospital should have done more to get Lucy Letby off the unit?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
Definitely. Why did they wait until 2016?
Do you think that some babies could have survived?
I think so, yeah. If they'd acted upon the initial suspicions, then they definitely could have stopped any more babies being attacked. And they need to be held accountable as well. Obviously, I know they didn't know there was a poisoner at work, and it's difficult to prove that. But the doctors did speak up. The doctors spoke up in 2015. They should have acted on that.
Is there any sentence that will justify what you've been through and what your sons have been through?
Life sentence. I want a life sentence.
But it's not going to do justice no matter what. She's taken lives. She's tried to take other babies' lives. So whatever sentence she gets is not going to be enough. It will be justice, but it won't be enough. Whatever the sentence comes. As far as we know, baby M did have a scan and the doctors did say that one part of his brain is damaged permanently. So he might deviate from his peers and stuff. At the moment, if you look at him, you wouldn't think any differently, just like a normal child. So it's something we'll just have to keep monitoring over the years as the years progress.
I do wonder, however, given that this was not the only place that she worked, given that there are other parents out there who have concerns about the treatment that their children received, what is your understanding of where we may well be in terms of other charges being brought on Lucy Letby?
Well, we know now that there is already an ongoing investigation to look at the rest of Lucy Letby's career. As I said, these charges relate to a very narrow part of her career, a year between June 2015 and June 2016. She was working at the Countess of Chester for about 3.5 years. Before that, she also did placements at Liverpool Women's Hospital, and Cheshire Constabulary have said they are already starting to investigate whether she could have inflicted harm on any other children over the course of that period. And we have spoken with a mother called Lindsay Artell, whose son was born prematurely at the Countess of Chester Hospital, a little boy called Asa, who was 2 months premature. And she believes, whilst Asa was on that ward, that he was attacked by Lucy Letby.
She wasn't Asa's nurse, but she was covering for somebody on a break. And felt the need to come and speak to us and say that, please, that I don't like parents getting their hopes up because we never know what could happen at this stage. The next day, I didn't leave Asa very much. My husband felt like I needed to get some air. I went for a coffee. On return, normally you would buzz straight through and say, Asa's mum, can you just wait there, please? And you can see directly into the room. And directly into the room is a screen around Asa's bed. So I'm like, no, let me in, and they told me that he'd had some sort of like insulin level, not like a collapse, but it had caused an issue.
She is still absolutely terrified at thinking what may have happened to her child. And we know that the police are going to investigate the broader range of Lucy Letby's career. And we know that they have already contacted some families to say that we are investigating it seriously in the case of your child. And that is, when you think she was working for 4 years prior to these charges, that's a lot of children that she would have come into contact with.
And of course, it's not just the families. One has to take one's hat off to the investigating officers at a time like this, on a case like this in particular, where to have immersed themselves in this case, to know the families, to know the victims, to know the person who carried out these horrific crimes, it must have taken a toll on them as well.
Yeah, do you know what, actually, even just you saying that's giving me goosebumps, because we were sat in a room, our team, with the senior investigating officer Paul Hughes from Cheshire Constabulary, as well as his deputy senior investigating officer Nicola Evans, and we had a really frank conversation with them about the investigation, about how they felt about it. And it was probably, we do a lot of police interviews, but it was honestly the most emotional and moving interaction I've had with investigating officers ever in my entire career.
I don't think there's anybody who has worked on this investigation who will come out of the other side the same person they were, because this case has just been so difficult on so many levels. It's heartbreaking to hear the evidence and to hear what the parents are going through and what's happened to these babies.
There is usually, following the gaining of charges, celebration, if you like, by the team, because you've charged somebody and it's starting the wheels of bringing people to justice. When the charges were read out, there was silence. Nobody knew what to say to it. It's that realisation of, my God, somebody has taken the life of these babies, and somebody has been responsible for these life-changing injuries to these babies, and nobody could say anything.
You got a sense from them that there was still a real sense of frustration that there is one question that they still would be unable to answer for the families, which is, why did Lucy Letby do this?
I don't know whether we will ever be able to answer that question, and only Lucy Letby can answer that. As a police officer, that's really hard to take. It's really hard to think we haven't answered everything for them. And it must be really difficult for the families to accept that we might never have the answers to why this has happened.
There's a phrase you used there, position of trust, that I think is at the heart of why so many people feel so uncomfortable and upset when talking about this story. You enter those wards and not for 1 second does it cross your mind that the people who are administering the care are doing anything but their utmost to help you. The idea that someone could be acting maliciously doesn't even enter your thoughts.
There is that sense, and we got it from the family's testimonies, we got it from speaking with the police, we got it from speaking with the Crown Prosecution Service, that sense of this was a woman in a uniform who had all the proper training, who was working in this NHS setting, who even said to one of the parents of the children involved in this case, when the mother came in and she wondered what Lucy Letby was doing, she said, "Trust me, I'm a nurse." And I think that was a phrase that when it was said in court, it really sent shivers down a lot of people's spine, because it is that abuse of trust and that betrayal, not only of the family's trust, but that of her colleagues as well. Although colleagues may have had suspicions, I think it's still such a difficult thing to countenance that someone would go into this profession, which is all about care, it's all about curing and helping, that someone would cross the line to do something criminal to the most vulnerable people, these children that the prosecution said so small they could fit in one hand. But unfortunately, I think it is a reality of this case, because it is the most horrific abuse of that trust.
Katerina, thank you. If you want to know more about this case, of course, just head straight to the website, where you'll find that Sky's data team have done a detailed look about how the police actually caught Lucy Letby.